Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on something that affects almost all of us. The rules that govern the tests that can literally shape our lives. You know, from getting into college to landing a job, tests are everywhere. And believe me, the stakes could not be higher. So that brings us to a huge question, one that really affects everybody. I mean, with so much on the line, how do we make sure these things are actually fair? How do we know the results are being used the right way? It's absolutely critical to understand the framework behind it all. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll talk about why these rules even matter in the first place. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the laws and ethics. After that, we'll see how the pros handle it, and we'll wrap up with the big debates that are still happening today. Okay, let's dive right in. To really get why all these regulations exist, we've got to first appreciate just how baked into our society testing really is, and the kind of power it has. I mean, just think about it for a second. A single score, one number, can swing doors wide open or slam them shut. The results of these tests can change your entire educational path, your career, even your ability to get essential services. The impact is just massive, which is exactly why we need a solid framework of rules. All right, so what are these rules? Let's start at the top with the big ones. The major federal laws that pretty much every school that gets federal money, and that's almost all of them, has to follow. And you can see a really fascinating shift in policy right here. You had No Child Left Behind, or NCLB, back in 2002. That was all about top-down control and just a ton of annual testing. But then, by 2015, things changed with the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. That law really shifted the power back to the states, giving them more flexibility and pushing for better, more meaningful tests. Next up, we have a really important civil rights law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as IDEA. This is the law that ensures the 7 million students with disabilities in the U.S. get the support they need. It's really built on these 4 core ideas: guaranteeing a free and appropriate education, making sure evaluations are fair, creating a custom plan for every student, and, whenever possible, educating them right alongside their peers. And finally, in our tour of federal laws, there's FERPA. This is the big one that keeps your academic life private. It was passed way back in '74, and it gives parents and students control over their own school records. You know, things like test scores and grades. It's literally the reason your professor can't just post a list of everyone's grades on their office door. But, you know, that right to privacy isn't absolute. The law does have some specific exceptions. It allows schools to share information in really critical situations, like if a student is transferring, or during an official audit, or in a genuine health and safety emergency. But look, laws are only one part of the picture. It's not just about following the rules. There's a much deeper layer here, one that's guided by a moral compass, a real commitment to simply doing the right thing. And this slide, wow, it really shows you why these ethical codes exist. They weren't just dreamed up in a classroom. They were written in response to real and sometimes horrific harm. The Nazi experiments led directly to the Nuremberg Code, the first international standard for human research. Stanley Milgram's obedience studies caused so much distress that they forced a total rethink of psychological harm. And that fraudulent Wakefield study, it created a public health crisis we're frankly still dealing with. So yeah, all of these historical failures led everyone, researchers, testers, institutions, to ask a really crucial question. How do we make absolutely sure this stuff never, ever happens again? And the answer lies in this strict set of principles that really are the foundation of modern ethics. It all starts with the most basic rule you can imagine: do no harm. From there, it's about getting permission, protecting people's privacy, and making sure you're using the right tool for the right job. And this is so important. Any test has to be proven to be sound, reliable, and actually serve a real purpose. So we've got laws and we've got ethics. But for the pros who actually work in this field, there's also a very specific playbook they're expected to follow to make sure they're doing their jobs right. In this book right here, it's the gold standard. Seriously. It's a huge joint effort by the American Psychological Association, the American Educational Research Association, and the National Council on Measurement and Education. It basically spells out the best practices for everyone, from a teacher in a classroom to a clinical psychologist. Now, what's so cool about this is how these standards take big, fuzzy ideas like fairness and make them totally concrete and actionable. Take a look at this rule, Standard 3.4. It's not just a nice suggestion. It's a direct order.
It means that everyone, no matter who you are or where you take a test, gets a fair and equal shot.
Okay, now that we have the rulebook, let's zoom back out. Because in the real world, these principles, well, they're constantly being challenged and debated. This is where the rules really get put to the test. So here's the key thing to remember. Just making these rules didn't end the conversation. Not at all. In a lot of ways, it just focused it. New data, new social questions, landmark court cases, they're constantly forcing us to ask, are our tests actually doing what we think they're doing?
Take the Flynn effect, for example. It's this wild observation that average IQ scores have been climbing for decades, sometimes by as much as 25 points from one generation to the next. So are we actually getting smarter? Or is it maybe better nutrition, more schooling? Or are we just getting better at the specific kinds of puzzles on these tests? This discovery actually forces test makers to constantly recalibrate their exams, just to keep 100 as the average.
And then you have the absolute firestorms over university admissions. This really exploded in the 1970s with the case of Alan Bakke. He was a guy who got rejected from medical school twice, even though his test scores were actually higher than some of the minority students who were admitted under a special affirmative action program.
His argument, which you see here, was incredibly powerful. He said he was a victim of reverse discrimination. I mean, this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it challenged the very idea of what fair and equitable even mean in a high-stakes process like getting into med school.
And the court was completely split. The final vote was a razor-thin 5-4 decision in Bakke's favor. Now, while the court said you can't have rigid quotas, it did allow race to be considered as one of many factors. It was a ruling that just showed how complex and divided the country was, and frankly, still is on this issue. So what's the big takeaway here? It's that navigating this world isn't about memorizing every single rule. It's about being aware of the bigger picture, knowing about the laws, the ethics, the professional standards, and most importantly, the ongoing debates that really shape this constant search for fair and accurate measurement. And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. We've got laws, we've got ethical codes, and professional standards to guide us. But in a world that is just obsessed with measurement, these rules are only as good as the people who use them. So the question is, who tests the testers? Turns out, the responsibility for fairness, that rests with all of us.